As long as I've been studying drawing, and it's been quite a long time, I've always been super impressed by Russian academic drawings. Being that I never studied in Russia or even traveled there, I never had the opportunity to get first-hand information about the philosophies and concepts that they use in their drawing academies. Eventually, I realized with the advent of online learning, I could get that access from the comfort of my own studio. So I reached out to an artist that I know through social media, Ivan Loganov, and I asked if we could work together as teacher and student so that he would give me some assignments. I would draw those assignments and get one-on-one critiques that would help me finally understand the philosophies behind the choices that these artists take to make such absolutely stunning drawings. The footage that you're about to see is a super compressed version of a lesson that I made for my Patreon students. This is the drawing of a skull that's followed up by a drawing of a male portrait and then a female portrait in the full course. Also, something that I know that he does, and also I've been doing for years for that matter, is to take a paper stump and really saturate it with graphite and use that to actually draw in some of the initial values. What it allows you to do is to make sort of a definition of planes in your drawing without using large hatch marks. You could probably even rub a bit with your finger to even that out if you're not worried too much about the archivability of the drawing. Now, of course, the light here we have coming from the upper left-hand side, leading to these strong specular highlights on the frontal bone. And that gives us a nice clear shadow under the zygomatic bone, far right-hand side of the maxillary, and the ramus of the mandible also, all cast into shadow. Now, this shape has its own sense of proportion, right? If I think about what the overall proportion of the skull is, how far over is this edge of the frontal bone, where we have this temporal fossa here. Like, where does that hit? I think it's more or less about like in the center, in between these two contours. Now, both of the eye sockets are recessed planes. But the nasal bone, of course, pops out of the middle of that. So I'm going to go ahead and indicate that. I also think at this moment that, now that I have this large, vague shape, I'm going to add in a center line. Now, what you'll know about my work normally is that I'm almost always using straight lines. You're going to see that I'm not doing as much of that here. It's partly because studying this guy's work, I don't see that there either. So I'm going to work in a way that is a bit uncomfortable for me, frankly. See if I can mimic what I see in this artist's work. Gotta be honest, I find it kind of freeing working this way with these really soft lines. This mixing together of value and line, and also, of course, that the lines themselves are so free-flowing. Ultimately, I don't think it will have an impact on the accuracy of my drawing in particular. But it is very different. It's very foreign to the way that I would normally block something in. I think that's about as far as I should take this one. I'm starting to get into the nitty-gritty detail of the zygomatic arch landing on the temporal bone and the way that the ramus of the mandible is kind of standing out from the external auditory meatus, and all these sort of fun like little details and things that really happen to a drawing once you've decided what the direction is supposed to be. Here, I want to be a little bit open. I don't want to dial in the drawing to be everything that it's exactly supposed to be before he gets to have his say about where he thinks it should go. After I spent about an hour drawing this skull, I had a meeting with Ivan on Zoom, and he talked me through some of the changes that he wanted me to make to my study, but also we talked about some of the philosophical differences in between how I was trained and how I was approaching this study, and how he would recommend students at the Repin Academy do that. The differences, in my opinion, were really quite significant and revealed a lot about what was the difference in between the kind of simple and basic, and I think sometimes boring studies that I would make of a skull or of a portrait, and some of the more interesting dynamic features of the Russian academic drawings that I'd always loved so much. The first major divergence in between the two philosophies was that I went into this project thinking I was making a study of a skull. As soon as we jumped onto the Zoom call, the first thing he did was spend about 15 minutes asking me why I had placed the skull in the center of the paper and what was my compositional idea. Now, I had entered this project thinking that I was here to make a study of the skull and simply to represent the anatomical features as I saw them, and also the three-dimensional reality of that skull. I'd given a little bit of thought, of course, to light and shadow, bringing out the specular highlight with my white chalk, but this was not the concept he wanted to start with. The premise that he put forth, and what I've come to understand to be the fundamental basis for all the studies that you're going to do at the Rep and Academy, is that you're here to make a composition, and that composition will include your subject. So I was thinking I'm making a study of a skull. He would prefer that I was thinking I'm here to make a composition. How do I make a beautiful composition from the skull? One thing you're looking for is silhouettes. This is where two values meet each other, and you can make a choice. Do you enhance this silhouette or do you diminish this silhouette? In the upper left-hand corner of the forehead, for instance, he recommended that I lose that silhouette. And on the far right-hand side, where we have the shadow at the back of the skull versus the background, he recommended that I enhance that one. In this way, considering the relationship in between the subject and the background, we can enhance the sense of depth and three-dimensionality in the drawing. In addition to that, the next compositional concept we want to deal with is what is the focal point? What do you actually find interesting about your subject? Look at the entire picture or the entire scene in front of you and ask yourself, where am I drawn to? What do I want to shine my attention and thus my viewer's attention on in this drawing? Now, the recommendation that he made in this case, because we're not dealing with a portrait of a living human, in which case the eyes tend to be a very focal area, that the focus could be appropriately made around the three-quarter edge of the skull, where we have a separation between a strong light shape on the left and a strong shadow shape on the right. This core shadow runs from the top right of the skull down to the bottom left on the jaw and represents a very organic and dynamic line that's full of contrast and interesting shapes. So our job then was to diminish, for the most part, other edges around this three-quarter line and enhance the sense of contrast and design along that edge. Another idea that makes a strong impact on composition is how you choose your focal areas. Let's consider three kinds of lines with three different trajectories: vertical, horizontal, and diagonal. Now, there are some simple and immutable laws in composition. Diagonals are always going to be more dynamic than verticals and horizontals. They just give a different effect. Strong verticals, for instance, will lead to a sense of calm, whereas diagonals are more exciting. His recommendation then was that you choose a strong diagonal on which to arrange your sharpest edges and strongest contrasts. This way, even with a relatively inert image like a skull sitting on a table, you can effect a kind of dynamism via this diagonal trajectory of focal areas. Now, if we're saying that artistic selection is the order of the day, we need to have some principles upon which we make the choices as to what we will select. What do you choose to include? What do you choose to leave out? These decisions will determine the outcome of the drawing, and we need to have criteria. Otherwise, we're just shooting into the dark. Let's first talk about how things can be left out. Usually it happens via a contrast or non-contrast. That's in the case of two different passages inside of a shadow or a light plane versus a light background. There are also omissions in terms of detail. If you look at the upper right-hand side of the skull, for instance, and compare that to the source image, you'll see that there's lots of surface detail and halftone shapes that in fact I've completely blended out by the end of the picture. The reason I've done this is because I don't think that area is interesting. It's not focal to me. It's not focal in terms of depth, and I wanted to diminish it in order to make other areas seem more important. Another area where I've omitted information is if you look in the lower right-hand side of the skull around the angle of the mandible. There's a totally lost edge in between the shadow on the mandible and the shadow behind the skull. This has an effect of diminishing the amount of focus and attention we give to that area, and in contrast to that, brings more attention to the areas where I've used sharper edges, stronger silhouettes, and clearer shapes. The most important thing that I want to impress on you about this process of artistic selection is that it puts the responsibility for making a cool drawing squarely on your shoulders. You are the director of the movie. You need to frame the scene. You need to make the picture compelling. And it's the choices that you take that will determine whether or not that happens. Now, rather than thinking about that as a lot of pressure, I would look at it as something more akin to artistic freedom. We all got into this business to try to express ourselves well, and this is the conduit through which that happens. I want to thank you so much for watching this video and spending some time with me today. If you think this is a cool lesson and you want to know more about it, you can follow the link in the description of this video. It'll take you right to my Patreon page where you can access this lesson and tons of other really cool information about drawing and painting representationally. Anyway, thanks so much. I'm Stephen Bauman, and I'll see you in the next video.